I am live. This live stream, this podcast is going to be about the title of this podcast is basically good for me, but not for thee. Um, this is typically me. This is going to be a very short podcast, so it's not going to drag on too long. I'll make it about probably like 30 odd minutes. 30 odd. I'll try to make it like 30 odd minutes for all intents and purposes. And what I'm talking about is what's good for thee is not good. What's good for me is not good for thee. And what I mean by that is people's ability to try and change or try to justify why they can do something but other people can't do it. And typically, I refer to these people as hypocrites, especially if they're doing the same exact thing that they're trying to harp on somebody else doing. Like you really have no room to talk when you actually speak on this stuff, which is actually pretty funny. Um, typically, typically you run into people who do this stuff quite often and don't even realize you're running into those people, which is actually pretty darn funny. Um, good example of that is great. I'm going to say great example of that is the people who are the people who always you'll see always trying to promote a certain thing or talk about a certain topic, and meanwhile back at the ranch they're doing the exact same thing that they're downing other people for, which is super funny. Like, so you're going to talk trash on this person, but you're doing the exact same thing that this other person is doing. Um, so what I'm going to cover in this podcast is the million dollar question, the million dollar question for men, um, the hypothetical mindset, the hypothet, I mean the I'm sorry, hypocritical mindset, the excuses, and my afterthoughts on it for all intents and purposes. What's going to be covered in this lovely thing. And this is your boy Internal Sadist. Um, typically, a lot of the problems that persist from things like this end up being, for all intents and purposes, categorized as something that you probably should. And the thing that bothers me about a lot of this stuff, a lot of the times when I see people do this stuff, is their ability to honestly have to deal with their ability and the way that they deal with things by saying, well, we're not talking about me, we're talking about this person. You're basically practicing the same damn thing and the same damn think that women would have if we were to, apply the same damn energy. And the sad part about that is, even as the philosophy goes on, let it be red pill, MGTOW, or SYSBM, and black pillars, actual black pillars, it's all about improving yourself. It's all about improving the knowledge. It's all about improving yourself mentally, emotionally, and physically for all intents and purposes. So at the end of the day, in your situation wise, depending on one of the latter two, um, but the problem that a lot of people run into, I've noticed in the philosophies are they tend to point a finger at the opposite sex while still practicing the same damn thing that they're pointing a finger at the opposite sex for doing. Like, I typically always laugh at stuff like that. Like, really, we're going to talk about this when in fact you're actually doing it yourself. Really, this is what we're doing now. Really, that'd be like somebody. That'd be like somebody. Like I said, I used myself as an excuse one time. That'd be like me being a criminal, trying to talk shit on other criminals for all intents and purposes. Why would I do that? I'm no better than that person for all intents and purposes. Um, that's typically how that works. I'm not going to down somebody who's doing the exact same thing as me and say that they're bad, or they're this, that, and the other. When I'm doing the exact same thing that that person is doing, that'd be like if I was a thief. I'm not going to sit there and down another thief and say that they ain't shit and they're this and they'll never be amount to anything. When in fact I'm actually doing the exact same thing. It's typically what I mean by that. That's the best way I can actually describe it to you, short term. So we tend to have a lot of men that have problems with pointing fingers at women for the exact same things that they're actually practicing in their lives themselves. And what I mean by that is there's the $1 million question. If your daughter was in a relationship with this type of person, would you be okay with it? And 9 out of 10 times, or 10 out of 10 times, 10 out of 10 times, your answer is probably going to be no as a man. You're not going to be okay with your daughter dating somebody doing the exact same thing that you're doing to another woman. Therefore, you might want to correct yourself for that reasoning, because at the end of the day, what the energy you put out is the energy that your daughters pick up. And this is typically the type of relationship that your daughters believe they're going to need to be in, or this is what they believe is normal. And this is typically one of those things where, like, single mothers put out the same energy when they're raising their children, and they believe that this is the type of relationship that they need to be in, a dysfunctional relationship. It's typically all it really is. You're in a dysfunctional relationship and you don't really want to admit it, but you want to bash women for being in a dysfunctional relationship when in fact you're actually in a dysfunctional relationship yourself, which makes no damn sense. On top of the fact that you want to say that women ain't this and women ain't this and women ain't shit and women is this and women is that, when in fact you're actually doing the exact same thing that women are doing, which makes no damn sense, which makes you a hypocrite. Like I said, the $1 million question is, would you be okay if your daughter was dating somebody like you? That's typically the $1 million question that you need to ask yourself as a man. Because I can't really see myself doing some stupid shit and then being mad at my daughters for dating a fucked up guy. Typically how that works. And the sad part about that, a lot of men don't really think about shit like this until they're posed with that question of the $1 million question of, if I was if would I be okay if my daughter was dating somebody who was doing the exact same thing that I'm doing to these women? And if the answer is no, which is 10 out of 10 times, it's going to be no, even if you lie about it and say, "Oh, I would be perfectly fine with my daughter dating somebody like me." You pretty much know you're lying. You're basically trying to spin it so you can fit your narrative for all intents and purposes on why you're doing the things that you're actually doing within that within the confines of your relationship. So you would basically lie. You basically are lying about what you're willing to have your daughters do or go through. For all intents and purposes, is usually how that works. And a lot of men, some not too many men will actually agree to that shit, or actually say that they'll be okay with a woman, with their daughters dating a man just like them. Not too many men are okay with that. Um, and the sad part about that, there's like a small minority of men that will actually say they'd be okay with a daughter dating, and I mean, that would lie about their daughter. They'll be okay with their daughter dating a man like them. Like a good example of that is, I wouldn't mind. Like a good example of actually being okay with dating a guy, a guy like themselves would be, I wouldn't mind if my daughters dated a guy like me. I would not mind it in the least bit, because I know what I'm capable of, and I know what I'm willing to do and willing not to do for a woman for all intents and purposes. So I know that I wouldn't be. However, I would say that my downfall is that I'm not always emotionally available, um, which is a bad thing sometimes, I guess. And yeah, I'm not always emotionally available, so it's one of those things where it's like that can be a big problem, which actually would make me double think about what I actually like my daughter dating somebody like me for all intents and purposes. But typically, all the rest of the qualities that I actually have as a guy, I wouldn't mind my daughters actually dating somebody like me. But the emotionally unavailable thing would actually give me reservations about my daughter actually dating somebody like me. That's typically how that works, if you know what I mean. Um, but there's a lot of men that can't even be honest with themselves about shit like that. Um, when it comes down to it, because they'll basically try to spin it in a way to make it sound like what they're doing is okay, when in fact they know deep down inside and damn well, if their daughter was in the same situation, they wouldn't let their daughter do the same damn thing. That's typically how that works. Um, like I said, which is the $1 million question. If if you if would you be okay with your daughter dating somebody like you? If the answer is no, which 9 times out of 10, or 10 out of 10 times, usually it's no anyway. Even if they lie, it's still no. Um, it's typically how that works. Because, like I said, I have reservations about my daughter's dating somebody like me, even though like the rest of my qualities are pretty spot on. But like the part about the emotional unavailableness of me actually makes me double think about my character for all intents and purposes. That's the fundamental difference between me and those guys is I'm able to reflect on myself and actually tell you where I lack at and where I'm actually strong at for all intents and purposes. Most guys can't even do that, and they'll just lie right to your face and be like, "Well, no, it's different, dog. No, it's not different in the least bit. It's the same damn thing." Let's just say, let's say, new situation. Your daughter's dating somebody exactly like you. Are you okay with it? They tend to answer, "Well, no, well, that's my daughter, and that's different, dog. No, it's not your daughter, and it's different. You're actually doing the same damn thing to somebody else's daughter." Think of it like that. And this is typically how a lot of that shit actually plays out. So that's one of the things that bother me about men in this day and age. They'll try to justify why it's okay for them to do something, but it's not okay for a woman to do the same damn thing. Don't get me wrong. No, there's certain things that a man can do that women can't do, but when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, it ends up being one of those things where like you have to really think to yourself, would I want my daughter in this situation? Or you have to think to yourself, would I be okay with my daughter dating somebody like me? A lot of men can't reflect on that type of thing because when they have to actually reflect on it and actually look at themselves, that's when they start actually having the problems with their own character. And when they have the problems with their own character, they start second guessing themselves. When they start second guessing themselves, they can only go two ways. They either get worse or they can get better. And it's one of those things where it's like you basically have to portray an image that you will want your daughters. You basically have to portray an image or a character that you would like your daughters to actually being in a relationship with. What you can't do is be like the rest of the single mothers and just be having a revolving door of men coming in and out, or in your case, it'd be a revolving door of women. Well, then again, let me rephrase that because some people like swing in the opposite direction. So either way, revolving men or revolving women, whatever you're into, this is typically what your children are going to see. Your children are going to see everything that you do, and they're going to mimic everything that you do when they get older. So typically, what they grow up with is what they're going to see, and what they're going to be trained, how they're going to actually go about in their relationships is typically how that works. So you never want to put yourself in a situation where your daughter sees the worst of you, or your daughter sees a certain behavior that she thinks okay. So when she gets older and goes off and dates, she thinks that behavior is okay. So now she's in that situation, and now you're upset with her when in fact that's the exact same energy that you put out for her, and to let her know that that's okay to be treated that way, or be in a relationship of that caliber for all intents and purposes. So it's one of those things that a lot of men have to do, especially the ones that are raised by single mothers. They have to break that cycle, especially when they have children. They have to break that cycle on the bullshit and the excuses that they use, how they're how they with the excuses and everything that they use to actually make it sound like it's okay to do what they do, when in fact it's really not okay, because they wouldn't be okay with their daughter partaking in a situation that they're the same situation that they're putting another person's daughter through for all intents and purposes. So it ends up being one of those things. As a man, you have to reflect on yourself and look deep within your soul and search and actually figure out, are you okay with that? And I use that for the reasoning because that's typically how most men think. What's good for me is not good for thee. A good example of that is men who have baby mamas. They're perfectly okay with like sleeping around on their baby mama, or even if they're not in a relationship with their baby mama, they're perfectly okay with like having a whole other relationships, but they don't really think it's okay for their baby mama to be having a relationship with, even though they're not together. They tend to think it's not okay for that to be a thing for all intents and purposes. And it's one of those things that a lot of men do this. A shit ton of men do this shit. And it's one of those things where it's like, well, no, well, you're my baby mama. Well, no, they're not. You're not together anymore. Therefore, unfortunately, unlike you, she has needs that needs to be met, so she has to move on. and find those needs and meet and get those needs met for all intents and purposes. And the sad part about that is men always try to get upset or try to control a situation that they're not even in or they're not even a part of, to basically try to make it seem like, well, that's fine for me, but it's not fine for thee. It's typically how that works. Now think about it like this. Cool. Race yourself out of this situation. Put your daughter as the woman. Would you be okay with a man telling your daughter that she can't date nobody else because she's his baby mama? She's struggling to raise the children, and she's trying to find a. I'm not saying it's okay to date a woman like this, but she's trying to find somebody who's stable, who would take care of her and her baby, who she. I'm not going to say she actually really, really loves, who she could quite possibly love and find, quite possibly love and be spend the rest of her life with for all intents and purposes. We'll say on the off chance. Would you be okay if your daughter was dating was with a man that was trying to control her dating situation because he was her baby daddy, basically? He was her baby. She was his baby mama for all intents and purposes. The best way I could put it to you. And if the answer is no, you're not. You wouldn't be okay with your daughter being treated like that. Then why the fuck are you doing the same damn thing to somebody else's daughter? And the sad part about that is men have this ability to always try to put themselves in a situation where they try to act like it doesn't apply to them, but it applies to that person. And the sad part about that is when you start bringing up their daughters, then they start double thinking about the shit that they're actually doing. And it's different. It's my daughter's. No, it's not different because you're doing it to somebody else's daughter at the end of the day. Because I'm pretty sure she's somebody else's daughter. And that's typically how a lot of this stuff works. And men will always try to tap dance around this whole entire topic or situation to make it sound like it's okay for them to do, when in fact you're really not okay for it happening to your own daughter. So how are you okay with it happening to somebody else's daughter? And the funny thing about it is, it's funny how we live in this society where we can do stuff like this and not really think about it, and not really think too much about the consequences in you know the fallout from the choices that we make as men. But we want to be we want to be able to control everybody else within the society, when in fact you basically grew up doing the exact same thing your mother did. You watched your mother do growing up for all intents and purposes. So basically, what you can't do is sit up here and try to do the same thing, but try to control your daughter's life or try to control somebody else's life, when in fact you're doing the exact same thing you watched your mother do growing up, especially if you were raised by a single mother. And the sad part about that is, I know a lot of guys that, who believe that this is how they're supposed to treat women based on how their mother's relationship was after their father left the household. They believe that they're supposed to, just come in, smash with the kids in the next room, and just be out like a thief in the night for all intents and purposes. When in fact, that's not how that's supposed to work. You can't really preach having a great society when you're partaking in the same situation that your mom taught you was great for all intents and purposes. Because at the end of the day, if your mom is doing this, 9 times out of 10, her mother did this. 9 times out of 10, her mother did this. 9 times out of 10, her mother did this. Or it probably stops, just a branch above, or probably, your grandmother probably was in a decent relationship, and your mother, somehow, some way, your mother got fucked up in a situation, the process of growing up for some odd reason, and that's how she ended up in the mess that she's in. Because what I've noticed with a lot of women is, like, a good example of that is my grandmother, mom's dad, was never on public assistance, or she never took any welfare, or anything like that. Which is actually pretty funny. The sad part about that is, the branch under her, unfortunately, got caught up in the whole entire, welfare system. Which really sucks once you think about it, because she grew up strong, independent. She was married. The guy died. She actually stayed together with the guy until he actually passed away, and she ended up working in the mill. So she never went on public assistance, and she's always worked for everything she got. Unfortunately, her daughters, on the other hand, were probably scarred by the fact that she actually was in an abusive relationship for all intents and purposes. Because I know one of my aunts right now, she gets in abusive relationships. She gets in abusive relationships. The other aunt is actually a drug addict. And the other aunt couldn't have children any damn way. So she had like some she basically had some genetic problems where she couldn't have children. And my other two aunts basically were one's an addict. Well, both of them were addicts, but one of them were in an abusive relationship and the other one was just an addict. And the sad part about that is I'm willing to bet any money my grandmother's abusive relationship played a big role in how they were developed and how they grew up for all intents and purposes. My grandmother didn't use drugs, but they ended up using drugs, and I guess that's how they coped with a lot of the shit that was going on in their household. Um, it is typically shit like that that pretty much happened when in fact what it is what it is. Because like I can say this about my grandmother, she she didn't get into another relationship after her husband died. She focused on her children and making sure they had pretty much the best life they could possibly have without making it more complicated than it needs to be by bringing another man into her life. She actually was strong enough to do it by herself for all intents and purposes. Because you got all these women running around her talking about independent woman and they can barely pay their rent on time, or they can barely pay their car payment, or they can barely feed their children, or they're focused on them looking good, but their children looking like Hurricane Katrina survivors for all intents and purposes. But my grandmother literally went into work every day and provided food and shelter for her children, all eight of her children, for all intents and purposes. And she actually worked hard to actually do what she needed to do to make sure her children were okay. And her children had the opportunity to go to college. Because the sad part about that, all her children had the opportunity to go to college. What they did with it was totally on them. What's up, MGTOW Elder Monk? You changed your name now. Um, what happened with that is all my grandmother's children basically had an opportunity to go to school on my mom's side. The problem is, were they able to were they able to actually complete it, or what they did with the decisions that they made as children going to college? Was it one of those things where was it one of those things where it was her fault or was it their fault? And then the sad part about that, she provided for them financially to finish college. However, when you start running into problems at college, like my mother, she got to college, wanted to go to college, got to college, and she wanted to come home. There's that one. Then you got my uncle who had a basketball scholarship and fucked it up. You got another uncle who had a football scholarship and fucked it up. Then you have another uncle who pretty much fucked up his career by just being a criminal. So it's one of those things where you end up like reaping what you sow as a woman when you pick the situations that you pick. Now the sad part about that, the only actually none of them actually succeeded in life. Now that I think about it, none of the eight uncles, none of my eight uncles or aunts succeeded in life on my mom's side. The most my mom did was become a truck driver. Um, like her personality, she pretty much quit that too. She made up a bunch of excuses not to continue. The sad part about that, that was never nothing that their mother ever taught them. Their mother was a never say never, never give up, never die type person for all intents and purposes. So to see her children grow up fucked up and not really ever doing anything with their lives, or not really ever making anything of themselves, or not really ever practicing anything that they went to school for, really sucks. Because the sad part about that, their mom was actually very strong. She actually literally was an independent woman that was actually an independent woman. She wasn't screaming independent woman. She was actually an independent woman. And she didn't get back into another relationship because she kind of figured that might fuck up her kids more than they already fucked up. So she basically did the best she could and basically raised her children by herself, and not really focus on relationships and shit like that to actually do anything. So what she basically did was raise her children and not really complicated it by adding a man to the mix, which is probably sometimes a bad thing, but at the end of the day, it's probably a good thing because you would have to worry about other things, or you're the person you're dating, probably touching your children inappropriately for all intents and purposes, which is always a thing. Um, and it's one of those things where like you have to worry about that if they're step parents, and that goes for women or men. If you're a man and you bring a woman into your life, you have to worry about, is it safe for your daughter for all intents and purposes? Is it safe for your son or daughter for all intents and purposes? Because there are women that are sexual predators just as much as there are men that are sexual predators. The sad part about that is nowadays there's more female sexual predators than there are men sexual predators, which is kind of shocking when it comes to children. When it comes to children, it tends to be about even or just a tad bit more women than men when it comes to children. Now, when it comes to adults, then it tends to be skewed more towards men, but there are a decent amount of women who actually partake in those depraved acts of, like, sperm jacking and, like, having sex with men while they're sleeping, shit like that for all intents and purposes. Or drugging men and stealing from them. So it's one of those things where, like, you can always run into these problems for all intents and purposes. So it's one of those things where, like, you got to ask yourself as a man, am I okay with what I'm doing to my children? And if not, what are the consequences that of my children seeing the shit that I'm actually doing and them actually mimicking it when they actually grow up? What are the consequences and what are the chances of that happening, that they end up in a relationship that you probably don't want them in? 10 out of 10 times you don't want them in the same relationship that you're in. And that's typically how it works. Like a good example of that is, I always talk about my daughter Talia. She is a hothead. And I can see her being like her mother growing up. I could actually see her literally legit kidnapping a boy. Like throwing him in the trunk and literally kidnapping him. I can literally see her doing that, like just rolling up on a boy with a bunch of armed people and just, throwing that nigga in the trunk, basically. So it's one of those things where, despite the fact that she didn't see that, and she doesn't really know about that whole entire story, unless she actually watched the actual YouTube video, which I highly doubt she did, because she didn't mention anything about it. But I can actually literally see her doing that to her boyfriend when she gets older, for all intents and purposes. Like, just rolling up like a couple trucks full of some men and just going to go down there and collect up her boyfriend for all intents and purposes. I can literally see her doing that because that's typically her temperament for all intents and purposes. Um, so it's one of those things where it's like, you want to always have the best. You want to always have the best environment for your children, and you always want to portray or have the best relationship with your children's mother or father for all intents and purposes. If you're a woman or a man watching this lovely live stream, you want to have the best relationship with them, no matter how the relationship is going, for the fact that your children actually see what's going on, then they turn around and actually mimic the same thing that they seen growing up and stuff along the lines of that. Thanks for checking in, most definitely. Um, they basically mimic the same stuff that you're going through for all intents and purposes. So if you have children, you basically have to be the beacon of hope, or the beacon or the role model for your children, so they don't grow up and end up in a situation like yourself. That's typically how a lot of this shit works. But the sad part about that is, um, you you have the sad part about that is you end up in a situation like this for various reasons. For the fact that when you actually do things, you also got to take consideration too. Are your children seeing what you're doing? Are your children going to mimic the same behaviors and attitudes and sentiments that you're doing for all intents and purposes? Because at the end of the day, your behavior and how you treat other people and how your relationships are actually going is a direct reflection of how what your children are actually going to be in a relationship doing. And this is typically one of those many problems that a lot of men run into when they have children. They typically think it's okay to just do what they do and nothing would ever happen because they don't really think of their children. The sad part about that, as a man in this day and age, you literally have to think of your children. You have to think of the outcome. And because I've always joked about saying, if you as a man, if your child is not swinging on a pole or, a sex worker, you made it in life. However, there's actually more to that than besides, your daughter being a sex worker or swinging on a pole, sliding down a pole at a strip club. Is your daughter a welfare queen? Um, is your daughter in an abusive relationship? Is your daughter in a relationship with a boy that you don't approve of? And the sad part about that, the really, really sad part about that is 9 times out of 10, your daughter's in a relationship with somebody like you. And this is typically what a lot of men fail to realize, or a lot of women fail to realize when it comes to their children, their sons. Your son's going to be in a relationship with somebody like you. And if you were abusive and you were doing the stupid shit that you were doing in a relationship, you can't be mad about your son being in the same relationship. Like a good example of that is if you were in a relationship where you were hitting the baby father all the time up in the face and throwing shit at the baby father, you can't be mad at your son for being in a relationship while he's getting hit over the head with shit and being slapped up in the face if that's what you were doing to your son's father. And it's simply one of them things that women run into a problem with doing, and they don't seem to understand that or get that because they don't think long term. But then they want to be mad at the girl for doing the exact same thing you did to the father of the child of the son. The same thing goes for fathers of daughters. You can't be upset that your daughter got into a relationship with an ancient motherfucker when in fact you were an ancient motherfucker yourself. It's one of those things. I mean, you can be mad about it, but you basically gave your daughter the image on what type of man she needs to date for all intents and purposes based on the stupid shit that you did as a man. That's typically how a lot of this stuff works. This is why the title is "Good for Me, but Not for Thee." Because at the end of the day, a lot of men do this and are hypocrites when they do this shit. Like they'll say, "Well, it's okay for me to do this, but it's not okay for a woman to do this." Well, no, you're a hypocrite, and if you have children, your children see this shit, and they're going to suffer from this shit for that reason. And they're going to actually go down the same path of the women that you dated, thinking that it's okay to date a man that does this to a woman because they seen you do it to a woman. And that's typically how a lot of this shit works. But men don't see this shit, and they always want to portray it as, well, I'm a man, so it's different. No, it's not. You're not a man. You're so different, especially if you have daughters. They see this shit. They mimic the same shit that you do with relationships when they grow up. This is typically how this shit works. Like I said, as a human being myself, at first glance, I would actually be okay with my daughter dating a man like me. Second glance, I would not be okay with my daughter dating a man like me for the fact that I'm one of the most emotionally unavailable people in the whole entire world. That's typically how that works. So I wouldn't be okay with my daughter dating a man like me for that one reason, because I'm able to look at myself, realize that that's a flaw. It's a strong flaw, and it's very strong. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, it's all about communication. Unless you can find a woman who's okay with you being emotionally unavailable, or sometimes being most times being emotionally unavailable to them, that's one of those things where, like, that's a problem within itself. If you can find a woman who's okay with you being emotionally unavailable and and being treated a certain way, that's a problem. However, I will say this: if you can find a woman that's okay with you being emotionally unavailable and understand the reasoning behind why you're emotionally unavailable, that's another story. And if she's willing to work with that and actually do what she needs to do as a woman to actually make it work, that's a different story. However, if you're dating a woman that's emotionally unavailable and she's used to being treated like that because her father was emotionally unavailable, that's a problem. That's a huge problem. You run a huge risk for all intents and purposes. However, she's actually understanding of that and actually understands how that works, and she's actually willing to put in the work to make it so that there's some line of communication or some availability with your emotions. Then it's one of those things that you can work on with that person. Um, but I would never really suggest doing it for a woman, or I would never suggest doing it for a man for all intents and purposes. Because at the end of the day, like I said, your relationship is a direct reflection of what your children are going to grow up and actually do. That goes for men or women, gay, straight, whatever the hell you got going on in your bedroom, or whatever your sexual orientation is. At the end of the day, the energy you put out in your relationship is the exact same thing that your children are going to mimic when they get older and they get into relationships. It's typically what I mean by that. So at the end of the day, You got to ask yourself, are you okay with the energy you're putting out in these relationships with your children? And are you okay with what your children are actually seeing and learning about you to determine if this is good for them when they get older? And if and on top of that, are you okay with your children dating somebody like you? Think about that. Because a lot of women aren't okay with their sons dating a woman like them. Because the sad part about that, the funny thing about that, because they pulled a lot of women on this shit. Okay, cool. Let's just say your family's rich, and they ask the woman, "You have a lot of assets. Your family has a lot of assets." They ask women. Okay, they basically ask women the same thing they ask men. If Are you okay with signing a prenup? No. Okay, cool. So you're okay with taking half of a man's stuff? Yeah, cool. Okay, fine. You're in a family. You have a lot of assets, and your son's married to a woman. Do you want your son to sign a prenup? Yes. Then how come it's okay for your son to have to sign a prenup for assets, but it's not okay for you to sign a prenup for assets? And that's typically the same thing that they got, the same energy that they got for women, because they asked her, "Would you be okay with your son marrying a woman and her not signing a prenup and her taking half the shit, half your family's assets?" And women said, "No, I wouldn't be okay with that." But they'll be okay with them not signing a prenup because they don't think it's right that they should have to sign a prenup, but they think it's okay for a woman that's married to their sons to sign a prenup. See what I'm saying? Good for me, but not good for thee. Remember that. Let that shit roll around in your head for a little bit. Let that shit swirl around in the glass like a fine glass of wine. And think about that shit. Okay for me, but not okay. Good for me, but not good for thee. That's typically what you're teaching your children when they grow up and go out and get into relationships. It's good for me, but not good for thee. So when your children see that, they believe that's how a relationship's supposed to be. That's the type of relationship that they end up getting into. And you can't be mad at your child for getting into a relationship like that. Only person you can be mad at is yourself. Because at the end of the day, your children are only mimicking what they believe a good relationship is. All because of you. That's typically how that works. So you have to reflect on yourself to become a better man at the end of the day. If you can't do that, that's on you. And it sucks being you. That's pretty much how it works. And if you get mad at this video as a man or a woman, I really don't care how you feel. This is why I got the death with a siphon. I mean, the scythe playing the cello. I don't care how you feel. That's something that you need to work on deep down inside at the end of the day. Because me making you mad only lets me know that I struck a chord that you need to fix yourself. It's basically like a cello with a broken chord. I struck a chord, it's broken, you need to fix it. Um, my after all thoughts on the whole entire thing, on the whole entire situation at the end of the day is I already talked about excuses and the hypocritical mindset of people. My afterthoughts on it was pretty much I just did it. Um, what's good for thee, what's good for me's, but not good for thee. And the sad part about that is that's pretty much that do as I say, not as I do mentality that got a lot of people into the hot messes that they're in. Because at the end of the day, that do as I say, do not as I do mentality is the reason why a lot of people are actually in the situations or the messes that they're in today. It's sad, but it's true. Because what you can't do is sit up here and say, well, this, that, and the other, and this, that, and the other, when in fact you're projecting basically your behaviors onto you're projecting your behaviors outwards, and your children see these behaviors. So now they're going to mimic those behaviors when they get older, and that's the type of things that they're going to get themselves into as they progress as older adults or young adults for all intents and purposes. So you always got to put out an image or a lifestyle that you would like, the healthy lifestyle that you want your children to partake in, let you be man or woman at the end of the day. And the sad part about that, a lot of people can't do that and reflect on that because they know that they got a lot of flaws Because a lot of people would like blow smoke up your ass and say they're the greatest people in the whole entire world, and they wouldn't mind their children dating them. But at the end of the day, deep down inside, they know that they're shitty people, and they wouldn't want their children in a relationship with these people. Because this is typically why mother-in-laws, uh, when the mothers of children typically hate the wife of their sons. This is why, because she's an exact replica of who she is, and she can't have that. And this is typically why there's always that dynamic. The same thing goes for the father-in-law of the daughter. The daughter is basically dating the same damn thing that she grew up thinking that's what she's supposed to date. Therefore, the father-in-law is really usually upset with the man because that's a flaw. That's a character flaw of himself. So he's basically projecting his character flaw that he portrayed to his daughter on how a man, the type of man she's supposed to be with, by dating her mother. And now he's upset because she went out and actually found the exact same man that her father is, and he doesn't like it. This is typically why father-in-laws don't like their son-in-laws. Um, or this is typically why mother-in-laws don't like their daughter-in-laws. So you got to think about that shit when you actually put yourself in situations when you actually have children. What are they? How are they perceiving this relationship to be? How are they perceiving how my betrayal of a relationship for all intents and purposes? If you can't really think about that, then you got a lot more growing to do as a human being. Let you be a man or a woman, a transgender, a gay, straight, lesbian, transgender, Apache helicopter, whatever you want to be. You have to reflect on that within yourself and better yourself. Because at the end of the day, you have nobody to blame but yourself when your children go out and get older and get into the relationships that they get into, because they're doing nothing more than mimicking what you did and what you showed them what a relationship's supposed to be. That's pretty much what it is. And that's pretty much how you got to look at things. What's up, Herm Williams? So think about that. Let that ruminate in your mind for a little bit. And like I always say, take it and swirl it around like a fine glass of wine and smell it. And then sip it. And just think about it. Think about the energy that you're putting out, and think about how you're portraying the type of relationship that you're in. The type of relationship you're in is betrayed to your children and their perception on how a relationship is supposed to be. So when they get older, this is typically what they're going to go out and do. Hate to be that way, but you got to reflect on yourself sometimes and actually really think about what you got going on in your life that's probably fucked up, that's going to fuck up your children, man or woman. But that's enough of my time. Y'all have a good one. Be blessed. If you missed the earlier part of this video, you can always go back and check it out. This is probably one of my better videos now that I think about it. Most definitely. But y'all have a blessed day. Be good to yourself. Treat yourselves like milk. Do not spoil yourselves. Always improve upon yourself. Reflect upon yourself to improve yourself, to make yourself a better version of yourself. And always be good to yourself. And always be willing to treat yourself, because you deserve it. Because nobody's going to love you as much as you love yourself. That's if you actually love yourself. Nobody would ever love you as much as you can quite possibly love yourself, for all intents and purposes. Y'all have a blessed day and be good.